Impact Close-Up.
NICAP, the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon. Who are they, and what is their purpose? These and other questions will be asked and answered tonight on Impact Close-Up. Your reporter is Fred Patrick. NICAP was formed in 1956. Their main goals, as quoted from the UFO Evidence, which is a documented report from NICAP, are scientific investigation and research of reported unidentified flying objects and encouragement of full reporting to the public by responsible authorities of all information which the government has accumulated on this subject. This reporter made a trip to Washington, D.C. recently in order to gather more details on this non-profit organization which has taken it upon itself to bring this very controversial subject before the public. We talked with several members of NICAP, including the acting director of NICAP, Mr. Richard Hall. We asked Mr. Hall exactly what his title was and what it represents.
I'm the acting director of NICAP. The director is Major Donald E. Kehoe, Marine Corps retired. I'm the executive officer of the organization, and I supervise all the investigations and the reporting of information.
We next asked Mr. Hall to explain a little further exactly what NICAP is and the purpose of NICAP.
NICAP stands for the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. We were formed in order to investigate reported unidentified flying objects, better known as flying saucers. We want to gather all reliable information on this subject and make it public. We have approximately 6,000 members. We're growing rapidly. In the past few months, we've gained about 300 members. They are a true cross-section of American life. You name a category, and we have a member in it. We have pilots, scientists, engineers, clergymen, and all sorts of people.
The governing structure of NICAP consists of a board of directors and a large number of experts from different fields of government work and scientific work. We asked Mr. Hall along this line to give us the name of some of his board of governors.
Mr. J.B. Hartranft, Jr., who is here in Washington, he's the president of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. He was the founder of the U.S. Air Guard, which is now the Civil Air Patrol. We have Virginia board member, Colonel Joseph Bryan III in Richmond, who was the former special assistant to the Secretary of the Air Force. Dr. Charles P. Olivier, who was the president of the American Meteor Society and the former head of Flower and Cook Observatory in Pennsylvania. These are just a few. We have 10 or 12 board members and a panel of advisors of a few dozen scientists and engineers.
We then asked Mr. Hall about publications from NICAP.
We have a membership newsletter which is published bi-monthly. It's called the UFO Investigator, and we have from time to time published booklets and pamphlets.
Also a publication of NICAP is known as the UFO Evidence. We asked him about this.
UFO Evidence is a documentary report which is a one-shot affair. We may publish supplements of it later on. This covers the whole UFO subject from World War II through 1963. The end of 1963 was our cutoff date. We're now planning a 1964 supplement.
We next asked Mr. Hall if any of these publications have been submitted to Congress for any reason.
Yes, we have. In fact, the UFO Evidence documentary report was submitted to every member of Congress in summer of 1964. We have also distributed it to, of course, to universities and other places, but we're particularly interested in having Congress look into this entire matter. There are some congressmen who feel quite strongly that there is a lot to this subject and that it ought to be probed. We have had difficulty in finding a committee chairman who is willing to stick his neck out a little bit and do something about it. I can read you a few of the remarks. Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois said he was encouraged to see the concentrated efforts of NICAP to have all of the facts about UFOs brought out to the public. Quote, "I will certainly offer my contribution of time and effort to get to the bottom of these reports," unquote. Senator Harrison A. Williams, Jr. of New Jersey stated, quote, "The UFO evidence report is indeed an impressive document and should be given the most careful consideration," unquote. There are a number of other congressmen and senators who feel the same.
I received several back copies of their bi-monthly publication of NICAP's The UFO Investigator. One of these publications, marked April and May of 1961, stated on the front page in bulletin form that NICAP has been assured of an official UFO investigation, including a thorough probe of the Air Force secrecy. As now planned, this will come within 2 or 3 months, but increasing pressure will probably speed it up. And it went on to say that the official investigators will evaluate verified UFO reports, contradictory Air Force explanations of sightings, and several other things. This investigation never took place. The reasons we do not know. However, in my interview, I asked Mr. Hall if, in his opinion, there was any chance of a congressional investigation perhaps this year.
I think there is an excellent chance this year because there is a great deal of public interest in the subject, and the congressmen and senators are getting a great many letters on it. In fact, it was recently reported in an area newspaper that Senator Thomas J. Dodd of Connecticut is now considering looking into the subject and holding some hearings.
You're listening to Impact Close-Up on W. Lee Radio. Tonight's subject, NICAP, the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon. This reporter has long been interested in the subject of UFOs, and I was extremely interested in probing the subject further. Upon arriving in Washington to visit the NICAP offices, the first thing I did was to get lost, which isn't very unusual for me. Finally, the offices were discovered, and I proceeded to walk up to the 3rd floor of an old hotel building. I entered a room stacked with files and loose papers of every description. There were envelopes with addresses reading simply, "Flying Saucers, care of Washington, D.C." The post office knew where to send them. There was a map showing reported sightings of UFOs this past year. Back copies of the bi-monthly publication, The UFO Investigator, and, of course, people. People talking about flying saucers and about the Air Force and their stand on UFO subject, which seemed a little strange to me. I talked with Mr. Hall and other members present about the Air Force's stand on the UFO question. Mr. Hall's comment was,
"Well, the Air Force has for the past 6 or 8 years issued regular statements which give the impression that nothing at all out of the ordinary is going on. Nobody has seen anything unusual. They have what we consider glib explanations for many, many sightings by excellent witnesses. So their overall attitude is to debunk the subject and deny it."
The next logical question in my mind was to ask Mr. Hall, why did the Air Force suddenly begin hushing up on the UFO question?
Well, we can only speculate. Back through about 1952, the Air Force was taking the subject very seriously, and in fact, it was reported that some very high-ranking generals in the Pentagon were responsible for the famous Life magazine article in April 1952, which left a very strong suggestion that these objects were from another planet. I think at some point along the line, the change in policy occurred where somebody felt it would be wiser not to say anything until the Air Force had all the answers. They're so far out on a limb now with their secrecy that there's no easy way out.
Another one of those present in the NICAP offices was Mr. Paul Dickey, who is a member of NICAP and is employed as a communications engineer for the U.S. government. We also placed this question to Mr. Dickey as to why he thought the Air Force had suddenly started censoring UFO reports.
I think basically there are several reasons. One is that it would be quite a shock to most people's ego as a person and as a nation and as a civilization to think that somebody is further advanced than we are. Number two, the government doesn't have, I don't believe anyone has all the answers, because this race of beings that has us under observation is so far advanced in technology, much further advanced than we are, and it would just not be reasonable to release all this information and say, well, I just don't know the answers, and it wouldn't be good morale. Number three, it would be pretty hard on the economy, especially the stock market, to break this information all at once. So I would say that in general it's better that this information be leaked out to the public by bits and pieces, and that they become aware of it, and that they let it become part of their lives, something to live with, as we became aware of the hydrogen bomb and learned how to live in a world that our lives were threatened. Although I do not believe that these visitors are threatening us, we have very little indication that they're hostile to us. The few accounts of hostility have been explained in my mind as being strictly accidental cases of violence.
I then put the same question to Mr. Hall. In his opinion, did he think that the UFOs were posing any direct danger or any kind of danger whatsoever to the security of this country or to the world?
I don't think there's any direct physical danger from them, because they have apparently been around for a very long time, and there's been no open sign of hostility, and I think people who have demonstrated this kind of power, if they had any desire to conquer us or attack us, they could have done so at any time. There would have been no contest. I think there is a danger if secrecy continues, for the very reason that the public will be uninformed and unaware of this, and if they suddenly encounter UFOs, or if UFOs suddenly start landing all over the place, this might result in some kind of panic due to their lack of knowledge on the subject.
From information I had read in the past, I had gotten the opinion that foreign governments looked on the UFO subject in a more liberal way, and were more liberal in giving out information about UFOs. I put this question to Mr. Hall, and his reply:
they are pretty similar. For instance, in England, they have a policy almost identical to ours. They use almost exactly the same words in denying that there's anything going on. A few countries are more liberal, or have been from time to time, particularly Argentina and Brazil. They have, Brazil, for instance, set up a high-level commission consisting of active military officers, representatives of the Brazilian Armed Services, attorneys, scientists, engineers, and they look into the subject and distribute information on it.
Upon reading the UFO evidence NICAP documented report, I noted that there were very few photographs of flying saucers. Most of those in the book were drawings of a photograph. There were a few exceptions where a photo was shown. I asked Mr. Hall if he thought there were any authentic photographs of UFOs available.
Yes, I do. We have some photographs. We don't have any copies of them available for distribution, but there have been various photographs of UFOs published from time to time, and a few of them come from very reliable witnesses and show some unusual things. Overall, we do not consider the photographs to be very good evidence of UFOs, particularly still photographs, because they're so easily faked. There again, it boils down to the character of the witness.
While at the offices, I was shown a copy of 10 photographs which NICAP had just received, which had been carefully examined by photographic experts to rule out any possibility of a fake photograph or have someone have been tampering with the negative. These, in other words, had, in the mind of NICAP, been stamped as authentic photographs of UFOs. 10 of them were in the pack, and I understand that they will be eventually printed up in a booklet of some sort and will be for sale. There were, needless to say, some very startling pictures. The recent flurry of sightings in Virginia during the latter part of December and on through January and a short part of February sent NICAP officials to the state to gather whatever information they could find. 2 sightings were investigated thoroughly by NICAP. Mr. Hall now gives us the details.
We interviewed or investigated 2 separate landing reports over there. One was the December 21st case reported by Horace Burns of Grottoes, who said he saw a UFO cross the road ahead of his car. His car stalled and the object landed in the field. We visited with Professor Ernest Gaiman of the Eastern Mennonite College, and he has done a very thorough investigation job for us. He is a NICAP member. The other incident was more recent. I believe the date was January 19, also near Waynesboro. This involved a man who said that he had witnessed a UFO landing and saw some small beings emerge from the object. There was no kind of communication. He just was confronted by these beings, and he stated that he was very frightened by the experience. Now, I hasten to add that we don't necessarily believe this story 100%. We're interested in objective scientific investigation, and that's why we were there. But one point I would like to make is that this man very obviously had been intimidated by some kind of government agents, unidentified. We don't know who they were, Air Force, FBI, CIA. But it was very obvious from talking to this man's friends, who are very responsible local citizens, that this man had been intimidated. He could not talk about his experience.
Mr. Hall, in your investigation of these 2 sightings, were there any material evidence of a craft of some kind landing?
No, in the first case, December 21st, there was physical evidence. Professor Gaiman investigated the site and tested it with a Geiger counter and found extremely high radioactivity at where the object had been seen to land. This was later denied by the Air Force, or they implied that Professor Gaiman was a professor of German and didn't know what he was doing. But the Air Force failed to mention that a couple of DuPont engineers were also present and verified the high radioactivity. And this is a good form of physical evidence, as was the fact that the man's car motor failed as the UFO passed by. In the second case, there was no physical evidence, but there had been several rain and snowstorms in between the sighting and the investigation, so this is not too surprising.
As you heard Mr. Hall said in the case up at Grottoes, the man said that when the alleged UFO hovered over his car or passed over it, his engine stalled out. This also happened in the case of a sighting in Williamsburg, which you are probably familiar with, where 2 men were driving down the highway, and in separate cars, both men said their cars stalled out as they came within sight of a large cone-shaped object hovering over a field. These sightings and sightings in years gone by have also shown cases where electronic effects have come about when the UFO had been sighted. I asked Mr. Hall if there was any explanation for this.
Yes, we have a section in the UFO evidence report which lists past cases of so-called electromagnetic interference. There is no known explanation for this. There are a few guesses that it apparently is some powerful electrostatic field causing it, but the exact mechanism of how it works, nobody knows.
Another case on record concerning these electromagnetic interferences happened several years ago when a group of jet planes were heading out to sea down somewhere in the southern part of the country near Florida, and something happened and they never returned again. So they sent another Coast Guard plane out to try to find them, see if perhaps they had crashed or something, and this plane too would never return. And although they could never be sure, they believed that some kind of electronic interference had caused their radar and their compass to go completely out of whack, and thus they lost their course and simply ran out of fuel in the middle of the Atlantic. This is, too, a very interesting case. It has been the policy of the press, both presses, to report on UFO sightings only within the state that the sighting occurs. I hasten to add here that both presses here in Virginia, I think, gave very excellent coverage to sightings here in the Virginia area. And for this reason, Richmonders did not know whether Virginia was the only place where flying saucers were being seen during December and January. We, of course, knew they were being seen here. And until this report, I feel, most Richmonders didn't have any idea that there were sightings elsewhere during the same period. We asked Mr. Hall about this.
Yes, as a matter of fact, the when the sightings were occurring in Virginia, they were actually occurring all up and down the East Coast. And apparently, these stories very seldom go out on news wires outside of a given state. So the overall picture is not realized by anyone in one state. We did get sightings at the same time from New Hampshire. Incidentally, there was a case of a car being stalled as the UFO passed over in New Hampshire. There were sightings in Massachusetts, Connecticut, North Carolina, and Georgia. But when the sightings stopped in the Virginia area, they also stopped up and down the coast, and now they have shifted out to the West Coast, and we're starting to get very similar reports from Washington State, Idaho, Oregon, and all that region. There was one case where a border patrolman reported seeing a large disc-shaped object which descended and hovered above his car, ahead of his car, and then after hovering for a few seconds, zoomed back up through the overcast and disappeared. On the same night, there was a reported landing in which the object left markings on the ground. It's the same sort of thing. It's been very consistent over the years, but it appears to be an unusual number of reported landings in the past year or so.
One thing in my mind which has never been quite clear and has left me to a very small extent a skeptic of some sightings of UFOs has been the unusual number of sightings of different types of objects and sizes too. They have ranged from round disc 3 to 5 feet in diameter to large cigar-shaped objects as much as 500 feet in diameter. The ones in Williamsburg and Grottoes here in Virginia reported cone-shaped objects. There are all kinds of shapes and sizes, it seems. I asked Mr. Hall if there was any explanation of why there were so many different shapes and sizes of these things.
Well, actually, it seems like there's a large variety of types of UFOs reported, but they boil down to maybe 8 or 10 distinct types. They're usually disc-shaped or egg-shaped or cigar-shaped. The cone-shaped is a little rarer, or has been until recently, but there are such reports described in the UFO evidence, including one just about 2 years ago of about 5 separate groups of policemen in Ohio who saw cone-shaped objects maneuvering around.
Mr. Hall, do you have any explanation as to why there are so few reports of cone-shaped objects?
That might be the late model.
Well, maybe that sounds a little ridiculous, but let's remember, if you were a little spaceman up there looking down upon us, you would probably wonder, too, why there are so many different types of cars running around. One of the other men we talked to, you've heard from him already, Mr. Paul Dickey, has for us a story now which he was a witness to, as were many other people, which took place during January, a sighting occurrence in Washington, D.C., which involved more than just the UFO. I asked Mr. Dickey if he would mind explaining exactly what happened that day.
Yes, I'd be glad to. It happened about 20 minutes past 4 o'clock in the afternoon. One of the engineers was closing the window in the building that we work, and noticed to be looking out of the sky above the monument, noticed these peculiar objects and called a friend of mine. He went down there and immediately called me, and a whole crowd of us congregated at the windows. And in general, there were 2 clumps or 2 major groups of whitish almond-shaped objects which were being chased by a jet aircraft which had delta shaped wings on them. These delta wings were on the back of the craft, so I don't know what type it is. I think we have an F-111 that folds back like that now, but could not be sure of the type of craft. But while observing these objects and trying to see the details on them, I did happen to see one of the jets pursuing it and turning right behind one of these objects. The object was slightly larger than the jet, and by that I could figure out how big the objects were, because I know just about how big most of our jets are. The object was about, I would say, 35 or 40 feet in diameter. And our calculations showed that they were about 12 to 15,000 feet and about 4 miles, 3.5 to 4 miles away from us. And we're moving well over 1,500 miles an hour. It might be interesting to note also that the Prime Minister of Japan was due to land at Andrews Air Force Base just a few miles away 1/2 hour later than this sighting. So I imagine the government had good reason to have their jets up there protecting our official visitors.
That report from Mr. Dickey concerns a sighting in the Washington, D.C. area just a matter of weeks ago. Going back now to Mr. Hall, I read in the publication, UFO Evidence, that there were continual references throughout the book about the famous, and that's in quotes, UFO sightings in the Washington and General Virginia area during the year 1952. I asked Mr. Hall if he could give us some explanation for this, exactly why it was considered such a famous thing, and exactly what occurred during the July and August period of 1952 in the Washington and Virginia area.
Yes, 1952 was one of the peak periods of UFO sightings. I believe it still is, even by the Air Force's figures. There were something like 1,700 admitted sightings that year. Now, we call them famous UFO sightings because by this time the Air Force had already explained all UFOs away, but the UFOs didn't cooperate, and they came back and buzzed over the Capitol and the White House and over many restricted flying areas. They were tracked on radar. They were seen simultaneously by airline pilots who saw them right where the radar said they should be seen. And this went on for 2 consecutive weekends right over the heart of Washington.
Another section of NICAP's publication, the UFO Evidence, was concerned with something called angel's hair, which I was completely fascinated with. I asked Mr. Hall exactly what angel's hair was and how it does, if it does, tie in with UFO sightings.
Well, we don't really know what it is, but it's one of those borderline things where some of it seems to be explained as gossamer, which is web-like material that's spun by ballooning spiders. And quite often these reports of angel's hair occur in the month of October, which is the migrating season for ballooning spiders. But there are other cases on record of material which is very much like gossamer, with the one big exception that it seems to dissipate if you touch it. There's no reason for gossamer to do this. The angel's hair disappears quite readily and is therefore extremely difficult to analyze, but it sometimes falls in great quantity and drapes itself over telephone poles and trees, and you would need thousands and thousands of spiders flying around to produce the quantity of material. So it's just one of these oddities that may or may not be related to UFOs.
Another question which we have not hit on the UFO question, and which we do not plan to delve on long, but just as a sideline, I am putting it in this report. Going back once again to Mr. Paul Dickey, who you may remember is a member of NICAP and is employed as a communications engineer with the U.S. government. I asked Mr. Dickey if he knew of any attempts by private concerns or by the U.S. government itself of attempts to communicate with beings within these craft, presuming, of course, that there are beings within this craft, going even further, presuming that there are actually spacecrafts up there. Mr. Dickey had this reply for it.
Yes, I know of several different types of attempts to communicate. There have been attempts by people that I know of to communicate through light beams. These were unsuccessful to my knowledge. There have been attempts to communicate by radio. I have heard rumors that they were successful. I do not know of any successful ones. And then there have been communications that I am sure of by people that I know where information was beamed to them in a semi-telepathic manner, in which they received information from these beings in a telepathic manner, something like ESP. And this may sound strange, but on a scientific basis, I do believe that it is possible.
Believing that or not, it certainly is a very interesting idea. Going back once again to Mr. Hall, the acting director of the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, we asked Mr. Hall what NICAP does when they get a report of a UFO sighting.
Whenever possible, we try to go right to the witnesses and to get first-hand information. We have investigation units scattered around the country that go out in the field equipped with tape recorders and Geiger counters and other detection equipment. We try to get the first-hand information to check out possible explanations, to check on character, background of the individuals concerned. We do have a standard UFO report form, which we try to get witnesses to fill out.
My last question to Mr. Hall, the acting director of NICAP, was, quote, Mr. Hall, have you ever seen a flying saucer?
No, not really. I saw one light phenomenon several years ago at night, but I wouldn't consider it a good UFO report. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't even be sure it was a solid object. It was just a light darting around and back and forth. But I'm not the type that holds that seeing is believing, because I believe in Australia and I've never seen it.
This week's Impact Close-Up. This week, NICAP, the National Investigation Committee of Aerial Phenomenon. Our story for tonight is over, but NICAP's story is just beginning. In the weeks and months to come, a lot more will be heard from this organization. Whether you believe in flying saucers or not isn't really important, but I do believe you should have an open mind on the subject. If you do believe, or would just like more information on the idea itself, you may join NICAP for a yearly fee of $5. This entitles you to at least 6 bulletins a year, the bulletin referring to the UFO investigator. And for an additional $4, you can purchase the UFO evidence. If you just like the UFO evidence alone, the price is $5. NICAP's address is 1536 Connecticut Avenue, Northwest, Washington, D.C. By the way, I too have never seen Australia, but I believe in it.
Major Keyhole is director of NICAP. He is also the author of a number of books on the subject of flying saucers, including Flying Saucers from Outer Space, published by Holt, The Flying Saucer Conspiracy, also published by Holt, and available in your bookstore. We have also with us this morning Cortland Hastings and Charles Leadham. And I understand that possibly in another 30 or 40 minutes that we'll have the pleasure of having Jules B. St. Germain, the attorney from Lynbrook, Long Island. He'll be joining us. Possibly some of you people remember the Armstrong Theater telecast. I think that was viewed around January 22nd of this year. And at that time, Major Keyhole, it has been suggested by many that his conversation was sort of faded out. Some people claim that they didn't have time to let the Major complete his statement. However, he was on camera for the entire time, moving his lips, and yet what he had to say was not heard. We've had opinions from people associated with the Armstrong Circle Theater. We've talked to them on our beeper phone. We've also talked with Kenneth Arnold on the beeper phone. And this morning we have the pleasure of talking with Major Keyhole in person. This is something we've attempted to do for some 2 years now. Major Keyhole, I wonder if you could first tell some of our listeners, as well as the gentlemen sitting around the table here, if you could tell us what NICAP is.
NICAP is a non-profit
private organization which is designed to collect and evaluate and make public all authentic information on unidentified flying objects or flying saucers. It has membership in 47 states, 14 foreign countries, and on its board it includes such distinguished citizens as Vice Admiral R.H. Hillenkotter, who used to be director of CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, Rear Admiral Knowles, Colonel R.B. Emerson, Army retired, Major Fournet, who used to be the #1 investigator on UFOs for the Air Force and the Pentagon, and a number of others. Scientists, educators, religious men. We have a panel of experts in various fields who help evaluate sightings and other developments, and then we try to cover these publicly in magazines and bulletins. And our aim is to try to get the subject out in the open and to get Congress to have open hearings so they'll finally strip away the secrecy.
You say, Major T. Hall, that you want the subject to be brought in the open. What do you think should be brought out, sir? Is there something that we don't know as citizens of this country?
There's a very great deal. In the first place, pilots in the armed forces, in fact all members of the armed forces, are muzzled to a great degree in regard to sighting reports. The Air Force constantly denies this, but I have in front of me here copies of the official orders, JANF 146, a Joint Chiefs of Staff document, and AFR 200, that's an Air Force order, which says that no one will discuss any unexplained sightings. They won't release them to the press. Occasionally, of course.
What is your opinion about this, Major Kehoe? What is the reason that they're trying to silence these people?
Well, for a long time, the policy has been to explain away these sightings while behind the scenes they're very seriously investigating and trying to get all the answers. They're also trying to find the secret of propulsion so that we can duplicate it. I agree in the last phase that they're right in keeping everything they learned technically to themselves. But I think it's a great mistake to deceive the public, treat the American people like children, the way they did for a long time about the H-bomb. I mean, everybody was told that, yes, it was something that was a little worse than an A-bomb, and they didn't let us know that we could be blown right off the map. And for a long time, missiles and submarines were in the same category. Now, right now, 40 to 50% of the country could be wiped out by missiles and subs. Now, that was hushed up for a long time.
Do you think that this country is in danger from the possibility of an attack by people who may live on other planets?
I've never thought so because the modern phase goes back 10 years into World War II, and they've had plenty of time if they wanted to attack us, unless it's a very, very long-range preparation. Of course, there have been a few accidents, and some people view those as evidence of hostility. But I think we're nearly under observation, and it's taking a long time because they are probably having difficulty in understanding us and deciding what to do if they intend to communicate.
Pardon me. What planet do you think that these UFOs are coming from? Or what do you like to call them, sir? How do you like
I call them UFOs because even though you'll find the word flying saucers in every book I've written, that's because a lot of people don't know what UFOs are. They're gradually coming around to it, but it helps to make the subject a little more serious. It's a very silly word, term, flying saucers. It's an unfortunate thing. If they call them discs, it would have helped, or unidentified objects. But a lot of people hate to admit they believe in flying saucers just because of that name. Well, I like to call them UFOs.
Well, first let's take care of a little business. Possibly, Court, you'd like to get in at about this time. I know that you've waited for a long while to have the opportunity of talking with Major Steele. Is that a call you have now, Major?
Yes, I'll be right back. If you can excuse me for a moment.
Go right ahead. I understand that there's a call that came in for Major Kehoe, and we hope that it may be something that will be of interest to our listeners, because if we have something that we think that we may have, I think it will. Major Kehoe
just as we were going to talk to you again, there was a call for you, a long-distance call. I was just wondering, was that a personal call, or was it something that may be of interest to our listeners?
Well, I think it would interest almost anyone who is interested in the flying saucer subject. This came from Captain Joe Hall of Capital Airlines. Captain Hall is a veteran. He's been flying 18 years, 16,000 hours, most of them at the controls of an airliner. Now, this is not a personal sighting of his, but it's one from a lieutenant in the United States Navy, and he checked on it and backs it 100%. Incidentally, Captain Hall himself had a sighting which was reported some months ago, a very strange one, as he was flying from New York to New Orleans. On this flight, he was also flying from New Orleans to New York, and this naval pilot, and we can't give his name, although I have it in front of me, because you have to request the man's permission before you can name him on the air like that. He reported this sighting. On December 11th, 1955, he and another Navy pilot were flying from Jacksonville Naval Air Station, Jacksonville, Florida. They were flying Cougar jets on a practice mission. It was a clear night, and they hadn't seen anything in the sky. Suddenly they received an urgent message from the tower to fly directly out over the ocean, and they were vectored, that is, guided, on a certain course. They flew several miles on this course, and they suddenly discovered in front of them an object with an orange-red glow to it, which as soon as they started to close in, began to maneuver at very high speed. Now, each one of these Cougar jets was equipped with radar, and they picked up this strange UFO, or flying saucer, but they couldn't get a lock on. That is, the radar would not lock on and guide the planes automatically, because each time they tried to close in, this strange object would either accelerate to tremendous speed, or else it would climb up to a very high altitude. In fact, the altitude during this chase varied from 6,000 to 30,000 feet. And the speed varied from about as slow cruising speed as they could make with the jet up to near sonic, which is roughly over 700 miles an hour near sea level. They said during this chase they were constantly receiving reports from the tower. Said by that time the tower was filled with high-ranking officers from Jacksonville Naval Air Station, and that they were being tracked by radar at Jacksonville, which showed the blips of the two jets and the UFO as it was out maneuvering them. They were also getting telephone calls from people all over the area, so they had direct, authentic reports from more than 100 ground witnesses. Now, this particular report was checked by Hull. He found out the name of the other pilot involved. He said there is no doubt in his mind that this was an authentic sighting, and that the pilot told him that they felt absolutely ridiculous, because here they were in high-speed jets, and this thing was just making monkeys out of them. This may not sound as dramatic as some of the sightings that have been published. But if you stop and think, the men involved, being trained Navy pilots, and the man investigating it, a veteran airline captain, I think it should make an impression. To me, it's a very interesting case.
Major Kehoe, we have so many questions to ask you, and I know that I have dozens of them, but I think in all fairness, Charles will give you a little chance for a couple of minutes anyway.
All right, sir. One question which has interested me, Major, is I believe you've mentioned several times that there is, to your mind, or at least to the mind of NICAP, a good possibility that these saucers are using perhaps Mars as a base of operations for observing Earth.
Yes, I've said that.
And I think you said that one of the things which led you to believe this was that the incidence of sightings had increased every time Mars was nearby over the past 10 years.
That's right.
Well, the thing which makes me curious about this is if indeed these objects are interplanetary or perhaps inter-system ships, so they must be capable of pretty fantastic range and speed and so forth, why would they even bother with a little thing like the extra distance across the solar system, and just wait around until Mars happened to be a little closer to come looking at us?
Well, that's a very good question. Of course, we don't know the maximum speeds or the propulsion methods. It's really speculation based on sort of an educated guess. The first time that this increase was noted, it was just considered a coincidence. That was in 48. There was another very big one in 50, a very great one in 52. Enough so that the Canadian government project decided at that time that they would make it official. It had been an unofficial deal until then. As far as the speeds are concerned, it may be that there are large units which do take advantage of the closeness of Mars to discharge smaller ones which they leave in our area, operating, orbiting, perhaps even operating from the moon. I don't know the answer. It's mere speculations, I say, but it is on record, however, that there has been an increase which precedes the opposition to Mars and lasts anywhere from 2 to 3 months afterwards.
On the subject of speed, I don't know whether it was you or Court who mentioned earlier that there had been at least one report of an object traveling at, I think, 18,000 miles an hour. Is that an official NICAP sighting?
That is one of which NICAP is aware. It's an official Navy sighting. It was referred to the Air Force. It was out of White Sands. As a matter of fact, it was Holloman Air Force Base. It was a theodolite tracking by trained observers who were tracking a balloon and about to track a missile, and they sighted this object. It was certified by everyone in the group and was considered, then he was now able Ordnance Laboratory, Corona, California. He's a guided missile expert. He says that he thinks that this thing was undoubtedly a spaceship, and he believes that they are operating from Mars. And he's still our high-ranking officer and is still in charge of the missile laboratory.
You mean the Air Force didn't succeed in having him broken?
No, he didn't.
Well, do you mean the course that they tried to have him broken?
No, but they
ridiculed.
They ridiculed the sighting, but they had nothing to base the ridicule on.
Well, Major, the thing, I'm not familiar with this case. As from what you said, I assume that someone who was tracking a weather balloon saw this object through the theodolite.
That's right.
Which, to my recollection, is a small sighting device, a tube or something with lenses in which you get an altitude and direction fix on a weather balloon.
Right. It's usually a very good telescope, so it's not a...
And then, according to my mathematics, this thing which was moving at 5 miles per second, they apparently followed that across the sky accurately with this small telescopic device.
If you're a good theodolite operator, you can track quickly. They track guided missiles with those out of White Sands, too.
Yes, but I don't think those go at 5 miles per second, do they?
No, but they...
That's from horizon to horizon in a couple of seconds.
This thing was not observed from horizon to horizon. It was picked up and observed until it made a very sudden, sharp ascent. And the thing that made the report impressive was the fact that the angle of climb was also calculated, and the G's involved were, I think, on the order of 36 to 38 G's. Accepted by the people at the base there, including commanding officer of the naval unit, and authentic sighting because of the experience of the men involved.
Charles, you said that you went from horizon to horizon in a couple of seconds. I don't think that this is quite what you mean, because the Earth is 8,000 miles in diameter, and if this thing was going at 18,000 miles an hour, it would have taken, say, 20 minutes or so at least to make that traverse. Well, I think you're mistaken there, Court, because most theodolites are not able to observe from one side of the Earth to the other, at least not the ones with which I'm familiar. The ones with which I'm familiar are based on the ground and can see to the horizon, which is, from ground level 5 to 10 miles away. They cannot see around the curve of the Earth. That's understandable, yes. Well, now, how do you mean it took 20 minutes? Well, I was trying to figure the 8,000 miles divided by 18,000 miles an hour. I was making it conservative. Is it your understanding that the theodolite kept... I don't know anything about the theodolite myself. I'm tracing your own figures. Is it your understanding that the man, wherever it was, with or without a theodolite, track this object from, shall we say, China around to Russia, which would fit in with your statistics?
No.
What was the 20-minute thing you gave me?
Because I was simply dividing the diameter of the Earth, which would be some 8,000 miles, and assuming that 8,000 to be tangential to the surface of the Earth, one could see at that point in a straight line from a tangent point in either direction, which roughly we would call horizon to horizon. And actually, we don't see around curvatures, we know. So at least it would be quite a number of minutes, which this thing would be within vision.
Well, Court, the thing I'm trying to pin down here, because this is a very interesting sighting to me, is I take it you are given to understand that the theodolite first picked this thing up when it was 4,000 miles away.
I don't know. I'm not familiar.
Well, maybe Keyhole would be more familiar with it. You have some reference on that particular sighting?
This is a briefing on it. I wouldn't have all the details here. It was calculated to be 56 miles above the Earth and flying at 5 miles per second. That is, you're correct, 18,000 miles per hour. It was elliptical in shape, and they computed the approximate size or length as 105 feet. Now that is the basis of that particular report. If I can find the rest of it later, I'll get it to you. But anyway, I do remember that, and the fact that McLaughlin added 3 other reports when he made this one public, and the others were not merely one unit sighting, was where theodolites had been tracking objects from various points in white sands, and also radar had picked them up, and in one case there had been a visual and moving picture film taken at the same time.
Major Keogh, do you think that the officials of the Air Force actually believe that there are UFOs arriving here on this planet, or at least hovering over this planet, that are coming here from other planets, from Mars or Venus?
You didn't say how many. If you mean the entire Air Force...
No, I certainly wouldn't want you to go on record to tell us what the...
I would say that there is a sizable group in the Air Force, and I know that the time when I was working with them, which was back in 52 and 53, there was a very good percentage that believed it, not only believed it, but thought the public should know about it. And there have been documents drawn up by Air Force intelligence officers stating their belief in that. And of course the most important one was the 1948 top secret estimate, which the Air Force, for the first time tonight, came out and denied. They denied because they were on the spot with that document.
Was that on the Mike Wallace shot?
That's right.
That was where the denial was made?
That's where the denial was made. It was given to Mike Wallace. What happened was that I had tried to say that the Air Force had these documents. I tried to say that on the Armstrong program, January 22nd. The Air Force representative, according to Mr. Irv Tooney, the writer for Armstrong, told him that would have to be taken out, or the Air Force would immediately deny it, and even if it meant denouncing the source. The source, not me, but Captain Edward Ruppelt, who was formerly chief of Project Blueprint. Ruppelt had stated the existence of those documents in his book, which was cleared by security review of the Air Force. I checked on that. It was cleared December 5th, 1955. They did not want that statement made.
Now, wait a minute, I'm sorry, Major. Who didn't want the statement made?
The Air Force did not want it made. And in his book. No, in Ruppert's book, they tried to hold up his book, and they were told by Doubleday, the publisher, that if they didn't get it clearance within a certain time, they were going to publish it anyway. So they got it. But on it, they had refused to answer questions about that for a long time. I had my Senator Byrd ask them specifically about it. In one of 11 questions, Major General Joe Kelly, head of legislative liaison, evaded all the questions, including that one. Nobody had ever pinned the Air Force down until tonight. I had told Wallace that I had proof of it, and they said it was absolutely untrue. I showed a portion of the script in which this was marked right out And anybody can identify that as part of the Armstrong script because it's in the same typewriter. You can see it. I've got all those scripts.
Would you read that part of the script to us tonight?
Yes.
I'd like to hear that. While you're getting that ready, sir, let me take a moment to talk about one of our sponsors, and then we'll be back with Major Keyhole. We'll be able to hear Major Keyhole read the statement that he wanted to read on the Armstrong Circle Theater telecast. Major Keyhole, before you read the statement that you were not permitted to read on the Armstrong Circle Theater telecast, I would like to have you give me your opinion, if you will, please, on two questions. Number one, why didn't Ruppelt appear on that program? According to TV Guide, he was listed.
Well, that's right. He at first accepted the invitation. According to Mr. Tunick, the Armstrong writer, he was quite enthusiastic about it. And later he said he didn't realize he'd have to be there for rehearsals for 2 or 3 days and that he just couldn't spare the time. That may be the exact answer. It's also possible that since he was an aircraft company, that they decided maybe it was just as well not to let him on. But they did agree to let him on the I got a secret program sometime before, so I assume that is the correct answer.
Mm-hmm. Now the next question, sir. Kenneth Arnold was in town. He was at rehearsals, I think, for 2 days, and he refused to appear on the program, and it was his opinion, and I have the telegram in front of me, a copy of it. He said in this telegram, "I will not be a participant on any program that obviously misrepresents and distorts the facts available on any subject broadcast for the public interest, nor would I allow any photographs or material properly copyrighted to be used on any program without written permission of the owners." You feel that Mr. Arnold was correct in that statement?
Well, I spoke with Arnold quite a bit. I could tell at the end of the first day that he wasn't happy about it, and the second day that he was thinking of pulling out. And I happened to see him the very instant he was checking out of the hotel. Mm-hmm. And I told him I thought it'd be better if he'd stay on because it would look bad, you know, though he's getting into the Air Force. And he said that he felt that it was a rigged program, or that may not be verbatim, but words to that effect. And he had wanted to state certain things and they said there was not enough time for it. I didn't overhear his discussion with the writers and producers. But I knew that he was progressively getting unhappy about it, and he sent them that telegram. They got it about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and of course somebody else had to read his section.
Are you representing NICAP this morning, or are you talking as Major Donald E. Keyhole?
I'm representing NICAP, and anytime you want my personal views aside, it's a little hard to split myself apart. But what I have said up to now is as a director of NICAP.
Fine. Yeah. Let me take a moment to talk about a wonderful opportunity for you. I think just at the time that I interrupted to take care of a little business here, you were telling us you were giving us some additional information about what occurred on that telecast, and also you were giving us a statement in reference to whether you were representing NICAP this morning or representing just Donald E. Keyhole. I have one brief question to ask you, sir, and then there's no doubt my other panel members around here have a number of questions too. I heard the interview, I saw and heard the interview with Mike Wallace last night, and I noticed when the name Menger and Adamski was brought up, you gave a very, very quick answer. You were not interested. I think that was your answer.
Well, I'd like to qualify that for this reason. I had an answer ready for that particular question, but I had been under the impression that the commercial break was in the middle of that show, and that I still would have after that, 10 minutes or so. So when the commercial break came up, and one of the program officials came over and said, "You got 3 minutes after this one," and he'd already had the question on the line there.
Yes.
And I thought, good heavens, I was getting ready to really lay some hot stuff out, including some documents and letters I was going to read. And so I thought, I'm going to dispose of that as quickly as possible. It was not with the intention of sounding hard-boiled, because I immediately tried to add that our policy has been one to examine all the evidence, and we have written all of the chief contactees and asked them if they would send in the evidence, and if they would attend public hearings, take lie detector tests, and so on. Now, that answer should have been said, "No, I don't accept it. The board doesn't accept anything because we don't think anyone has presented verified evidence." But I was rushing through trying to get to my main points before Mike Wallace could cut me off, and that's why it sounded very explosive. It was not meant as an insult type of answer, but it was meant as an emphatic, quick answer to get on to me before my 3 minutes were gone.
Well, I hope you realize that you'll have plenty of time to give us some of that information. Charles, did you want to pick up something here?
There's one small point, Major. I noticed that earlier on television and just now you said you offered these gentlemen, the presumed contactees, the opportunity to come to Washington, or perhaps someone will go there, I don't know how it would work, and take a lie detector test. And if I had a story about contacting Venusians, and were told in effect that my story would stand or fall on the result of a lie detector test, I think I would quite justifiably turn it down too, because as you know well, these are not exactly reliable instruments. They are not admitted as court evidence, I don't believe. Is that true, Drew?
Generally speaking, they're not admitted as court evidence. Of course, the question of reliability, you'll get various opinions.
But as long as there are at least a few expert opinions on non-reliability, I would hate to have my whole story fall on the fact that something went wrong with the polygraph when I happen to be tied to it.
Well, if I understand the Major correctly, I believe this is merely an incident of one of various tests to be applied and appearing before a panel. Is that right, sir? That's right. It was a question that was suggested as one of the 8. In fact, we had originally about 20, and it just got to be too long and cut it down. Now, I don't know how I would react if I'd had a contact and somebody said to me about lie detector tests. I would check very carefully into who was making the test, and perhaps to see there were 2 or 3 people there, and that they were in no way connected with the military, and I would insist that one of them not be connected with NICAP. I merely want to get the reaction of these people to see whether, under certain conditions, they would accept it, or whether, and also whether they'd come for public hearings.
Had anybody accepted it, sir?
If I remember correctly, 2 people did. One of them was Angelucci and Van Tassel.
Van Tassel agreed to submit to a lie detector?
I will have to check, but my memory is to that effect. I think we have it in the magazine here. We printed the replies that we got.
But what happened?
Well, the point is this. We had stated that whenever NICAP was able to have these hearings, it's going to be an expensive proposition to transport somebody from the West Coast and to put them up there for whatever time it takes for these hearings. And I also have always said that I felt the investigation of factual sightings should come first.
This is WOR Radio, your station in New York, 710 on the dial. Major Kehoe, don't you think, though, that that's a rather unfortunate situation? In other words, let us say, as an example, that I, one night, come in front of this microphone and I say that I was driving down the Jersey Turnpike and I saw a light in the sky and something landed near the side of the highway, and it was a Venusian spaceship. And I took a ride in it. And of course, I do this show, and there'd be some people would believe me, and many people wouldn't believe me, the same as any of the others. So immediately, you hear about it, and you send me one of these forms to fill out.
And I fill it out, and I agree. Yes, by all means, Major Kehoe, bring the lie detector test up. Of course, you possibly sent this form maybe to 40 or 50 people, and I am one of 3 people who've agreed to submit to the lie detector. The outcome of it is you don't have this available at the present time. Wouldn't you say that this would sort of imply that I am honest and that I'm telling a legitimate story because I'm willing to submit to it?
I wouldn't say that implies that 100%.
No, not 100%.
There are a lot of people that will agree to anything because they are convinced of what they are saying. You know that sometimes a man can be so convinced of the truth after he said it enough times that he might even be able to pass the lie detector test. I've been told of that
too, yes.
I think that's possible. The whole thing was unfortunate. I did not want to go into this contact business so soon because I felt that your first job is to convince the American people and the press that these things are real. After that, the other things in the right order.
Don't you think that's the easiest way? And believe me, I'm not being critical of you, sir, or NICAP. I'm not in the position to be, and I don't think it's my right to be. But you sit here, Major Kehoe, and you tell us about these sightings, and they're extremely interesting. And, of course, you have no tangible proof to afford us this morning, except the fact that this pilot and that pilot and this Air Force general has made the statements. These are fine and dandy. But don't you think it would prove more to the American public that there is something to this story if it could be proven that these fellows who claim that they've been talking to Venusians and Martians, if it could be proven that they're telling the truth? I don't buy it myself, frankly, Major.
All right,
it would be easier to sell me the idea that this is something that
happens. I'll try to answer that. Before I do, I want to make one little correction in there about not having anything tangible. There are photographs, and there are photographs of radar scopes showing triangulation of objects, and there are pieces of metal which have fallen from objects which have disintegrated and which were reported as UFOs just before they did. So I would say there is some tangible evidence. Now, to go into this other, I know quite a number of veteran newspaper men and a number of newscasters in Washington. I said, what is your opinion? What's the best policy for NICAP? After I was put in there and inherited, and sometimes wish I'd never been born. But anyway, I said, no matter what you personally believe, it is smarter to concentrate on your factual sightings, because the minute you start in on any other angle, you're going to lose the press. Then you will start being ridiculed as having accepted contact stories. Whether you accept them or not, the minute you start sounding as though you do. He said, the best advice we can give you is not even to mention them. Don't say yes or no, just keep still. So I tried that at first. It didn't work. The pressure built up because there are many people who are sincerely convinced that these things are true. And some people who accept all of them. And some people who accept a few. The pressure got so great that I was accused of clamping a lid. Here I am, the guy trying to expose censorship, and I'm clamping a lid on the contact story. So I said, all right. So I got advice from a lot of people about a policy. And we set out these questions, and we did not send them to a lot of people because we selected the best known ones. There are by now, I think, hundreds who claim contact or communication here and abroad. So it didn't satisfy anybody. There are people that don't believe in them that wrote in and said, what are you bothering with those for? What's the idea? Now, we thought NICAP was a factual organization. The people who believe in the contacts wrote in and said, here you are trying to force people to take lie detector tests. The result is it's no better than it was. I will say this. I have tried very hard, and tonight perhaps is the first time that I have said anything that sounded a little hard-boiled. I've tried very hard to say we are going to be impartial. If anybody can bring in absolute proof that will convince not me, but the advisors and the board, that will be right out in writing with a NICAP banner on it.
I know it's already on radar. The Major can answer this better than I. The radar scope indicates a speed in excess of that which can be accomplished by any aircraft known to us here that would indicate that it is something of an unusual origin. Then the next question, of course, is what is it? I think basically there are three classes. One, spaceships. Number two, the secret weapon. And three, a little advanced theory that is some type of life form in the air. Do you know of any other classes, Major? Or theories?
No, except the Air Force answer is that the radar men are always wrong, or something's wrong with the set. But you have to rule that out when you take the hundreds of radar reports and realize that the men who make them are the ones who either GCI, ground control intercepts in the Air Force, and are trained to guide fighters in very closely to enemy bombers, or they are civil aeronautics experts, including the men who can bring you in right down to the runway, and you don't see anything almost till you're there, and they can say, you're 5 feet to the left, over, down 5, up 4. I mean, they spot you instantly. If those men aren't able to recognize the difference between a solid object coming in under control and a bird or a temperature inversion or something like that, they'd be cracking up planes all over runways, and you wouldn't be having airliners flying in under low ceilings in the airports. Now, those radar men are good, and they very, very much resent the Air Force statements that radar doesn't prove anything. Now, they've even got Air Force radar now, 3,000 miles, is supposed to pick up an enemy missile. They're wonderful. They just say, oh, that's great. One is good. Why isn't the other any good?
One brief question, Major Kehoe. You have made the statement a couple of times this morning that you feel that the government is acting as sort of a big brother. They're going to tell us the things that they think that we can stand to hear, and the things that we shouldn't hear, they're not going to tell us about. Now, in other words, what you've implied is that they possibly know as much as you do, maybe even a little bit more about these things that are flying around, and possibly they know that they're coming from other planets. You sort of implied this anyway. Now, my question is just this. Is it possible, sir, that maybe some foreign government, I'm talking about a government on this planet, that maybe they've developed something that acts like UFOs? And maybe our government is familiar with the fact that it may be something that was built by Russia, and that they don't want to tell us that because they're afraid that it may cause too much concern.
Well, that, of course, was the first answer that the Air Force and the Navy and the Army considered back in '47 when they had the mass sightings. There were a lot of scared people running around the Pentagon when these things finally seemed to be real. And then they began to take some stock and said, well, either the Soviet has had a terrific leap here, and less than 2 years since the end of World War II, and their devastated factories, and practically nothing, and all of a sudden they've got a perfect global weapon, or else these are coming from somewhere else. So they did a hasty intelligence job. The end of 6 months, with the help of the British, they had ruled out any possibility these could be Russian. But now, just to say for a minute that they were Russian, it would mean that since 1940, actually since the middle of World War II, the Russians had something in operation, or maybe it was the Germans and the Russians took it over. And then they perfected it by '47. For 11 years, they've been building ordinary jets and working like mad to build missiles and get Sputniks in the air when they already have the ultimate perfect device and weapon. They were letting us fight them when all they had to do was to take one of these things and say, we are going to have it over the center of Wichita, Kansas tomorrow, and everybody better get out of there, because when we have it over there, we're going to drop something. And they could prove it without any doubt, and they would have owned the world by now. I don't think there's any possibility of a Soviet answer, and the U.S. secret weapon answer rules out the same way, because we wouldn't be so afraid. We would certainly not have failed to put Sputniks in the air. And we would not be building ordinary jets and missiles.
Major Kehoe, why doesn't the Air Force want NICAP?
Well, they know very well that our intention is to get everything out in the open and to try to get the answers made available to the press In fact, one suggestion we had was that they hold a huge press conference and bring out everything, and we will be over there giving our side and asking questions too. Let's get it out in the open, and that's one thing they will never agree to. So there are too many questions that were just they couldn't answer, and that's also why we want this Senate investigation.
Couldn't answer, or they don't want to answer?
Oh, they could answer some of them, most of them, but I do think there's some things that they don't understand even yet about these. I'm not even sure they know the motives, and I'm sure they know that these things operate in cycles, and they probably know the method of propulsion. I think they do have a good idea of the type of beings involved, although I'm not sure of that. And they know very well that they're real and that they're from some other part of the universe.
Would you repeat that again a moment?
They know they're real.
Now, who knows?
The Air Force knows.
The Air Force knows what?
That these objects are real, and they're objects under intelligent control of beings from some other part of the universe, either our solar system or outside.
Howard Chopp stated that, didn't he, in 1953, when after he was head of the information liaison at the Pentagon?
He didn't say it that way. What he said was that there was a secret report which had been held up, and I found out which one it was later on. That was the Foreign Aid report, and then the 1948 report was the big one. That was the one where ATIC declared these things were interplanetary spaceships. And even though all the Air Force doesn't accept it, though that was the top brains at that time in intelligence.
What do you feel is, this is the last question, Major Kehoe, what do you feel is the best way of the American public counteracting the suppression of news by the Air Force, in fact, this out-and-out censorship against which we fought World Wars I and II?
Well, I still think that the only way you can help now is to write to your congressmen, write to your senators, and ask that they pass the word on to the Senate committee and have open hearings. And not just call the Air Force and NICAP and a few scientists and so forth, but call at least 100 selected witnesses, the best airline captains, I mean the ones with the most experience who've seen these, top-ranking officers in the armed forces, the civil aeronautics tower operators and radar operators who've seen these things, the guided missile trackers, the people who photographed them. Get them in there. It may take a month. But believe me, when they get through with a thing like that, it'll be out in the open and they can't ever close it up again.
To whom should they write in Congress? You say that some investigation committee.
Each citizen write to his own congressman and senators. And that's it.
Thank you very, very much, Major Kehoe. I certainly appreciate it, and I know our listeners do, to have the opportunity of hearing your opinions on this subject, and I sincerely hope that when and if you do come back to New York, and if you can spare the time, that you will join us again.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure, and I appreciate your cooperation.
Thank you, sir.